Yeah, so I love sanctuaries, and I absolutely have to add a personal note here that a pilgrimage to Farm Sanctuary in Ithaca, New York, was one of Susan and my first moves, when we first got interested in these things. And I mention in the book, right? In fact, I think it's probably my favorite line in the book. It doesn't have to be anybody else's, but when you're writing a book, there are some pages you feel like I knocked that out of the park. And then there are other pages you look at and you're like, maybe I got up on the wrong side of the bed that morning. But one of my favorite lines, if not my favorite line in the book, is that if you want to learn truly to love justice, feast your eyes and imagination on what flourishing lives look like, so you can see with clarity what oppression steals away. And I that insight has just been so important to my own journey, and especially to the way that I teach these issues. Because if you want to see so-called farmed animals, and I actually don't use that term. I like to say animals used for farming because that's the truth. If you want to see animals used for farming flourishing, you have one and only one option these days, and that's to go to a sanctuary.
Welcome to the Better Life for Animals podcast, where we amplify the voices of animal advocates, sanctuaries, and changemakers working toward a kinder, more compassionate world. Through powerful stories and expert insights, we shine a light on the efforts to rescue, protect, and advocate for animals. Be sure to subscribe wherever you're watching or listening. Every follower helps us reach more people. And support animal sanctuaries. Enjoy the conversation.
Matthew Halteman is a professor of philosophy at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where he has been teaching since 2003. He has been a fellow at the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics in the UK since 2008, contributing to interdisciplinary scholarship on animal and food ethics. A passionate advocate for compassionate living, Halteman's work focuses on the ethical dimensions of human and animal relationships, as well as the philosophical exploration of life as a lived practice. He is the author of Hungry, Beautiful Animals, The Joyful Case for Going Vegan, a book that invites readers to embrace the abundant joys of vegan living. Matthew, welcome to the podcast.
It's so wonderful to be here, Cheryl. I just can't wait for this conversation.
Oh, thank you. I absolutely love your book.
Oh,
I've got my copy right here.
Oh, look at that. Well, I'll get in on it.
Okay. Hungry, Beautiful Animals. And I saw on Instagram that famous tiramisu that you feature in your book. It's so gorgeous. And I'm telling you, it's coming. I'm making it for my next dinner party. Excellent. I love the part where you put all caps in certain areas. It's like, try it another way and it might not work, right?
Yes, I think enthusiasm is one of my best known traits, and I had to bring it out in that recipe because, there's a little bit of a time investment to get it just right, but it's like every other thing in life that's worth doing. It takes a little bit of an investment.
Anything worth doing is worth doing well. Well, I was so taken with that post, Matthew, that I thought I'd start with reading a part of it, if you don't mind.
Oh, of course.
So what if going vegan could be more like following your fork to the deep pleasure of that second bite of tiramisu, than like summoning the willpower to avoid the shame and blame of moral failure? What if vegan living could be powered to desire rather than shame, so that the dynamo of our commitment is attraction to what we really want deep down, rather than the obligation to unappealing expectations? I love that. I think that just says it. It's focusing on aspiration and by imagining what could be. Tell us what inspired you to write Hungry, Beautiful Animals.
Yeah, well, it's a long story. I'll try to keep it short, but it doesn't have such an inspiring start, Cheryl, right? I mean, for a little while, when you get into these issues, it's so easy to focus on the suffering and the scarcity. I think like most people who come to discover out of nowhere, what's really going on behind the scenes in industrial animal agriculture. I mean, I guess I was just shocked, and horrified And, I felt guilty. I felt a lot of shame. I felt like if I didn't act on it right away, that I was going to be blameworthy to boot. And I'm a philosophy professor. And so all we've got is authenticity, right? So if we're getting up there in front of our students every day and saying, be the change you want to see in the world, right? Live out the vision of the world that you claim for your own. And all of a sudden I had all this devastating information to try to reconcile with one of my very favorite things to do, which is eating, right? And so to say the least, my initial, workings in this stuff started from where a lot of us start, which is deep lament, right? Over the suffering that our fellow creatures experience in this system and in other oppressive industries. And as I sort of got my legs under me teaching these things, I began to notice that students respond so much differently when you lead with the things that are beautiful. Right? They were so intrigued to learn that whales have matriarchally structured families, right? That make plans to visit different pods, in glorious places in the Salish Sea. And they were just captivated by the intelligence of pigs and sort of delighted to realize, oh, a lot of that stuff we read about in Charlotte's Web, it's true, right? That these creatures have these amazing capacities and beautiful lives, and really they have biographies, right? They have pasts that they can feel either excited about or anxiety over. They have futures that they can project themselves into. Anyone who's ever gotten their suitcase out, getting ready to go on a trip and watch their dog respond to seeing
Not
that
happy.
You're about to leave, not at all, right?
Nope.
So coming to terms with just the beauty of deeper kinship, and that was possible with other creatures, that really was exciting to my students. And so as the years went by and I continued to observe, everybody, of course, hates the suffering. Everybody finds the system sort of devastating and depressing. But on the other hand, everybody finds the animals themselves, the things they're capable of, the lives that they could live if we only became, better partners in their becoming. That really had a leavening effect on my students. And so I started thinking, well, geez, what if I pivoted my pedagogy, right, my approach to teaching away from the kind of scarcity model where I present people with, look at all this terrible suffering. Don't you feel awful? Shouldn't we do better? Look at these obligations. Get off the moral couch, right? And get with the program. What if I pivoted away from that to showing them the beauty of a world where we don't need oppression and suffering to eat the rainbow every day in a diet that is vastly healthier, to eat the rainbow every day and not subject any workers to assembly lines that put their own lives at risk in addition to the animals who have to suffer and die? What if from the soil to the stratosphere, this healing way of eating could change our relationship to the planet? And it occurred to me, wow, there's a lot of really good news, right? Going vegan is a joyful abundance aggregator. So why don't we lead with that, right? Why isn't that job one? Why isn't that the headline? That going vegan has this beautiful effect of harmonizing all these different parts of what I think of as your inner family, right? Your physical and social and emotional and intellectual and moral selves, even as it, puts changes into place that can radiate healing out into the world from the soil to the stratosphere. I just thought this is a winning, wooing. It's not even an argument, right? It's a story. It's a narrative. And I just have found over the years that since I've pivoted from obligation to opportunity, right, from shame to delight and joy, my message has just become so much more exciting to people and so much more motivating to people. And so Hungry Beautiful Animals was an attempt to try to bottle that, right? Because when you're teaching, you have this intimacy, you have this rapport, you have the trust of the people you're working with. I wanted to try to write a book that would take that sort of narrative approach with a lot of good humor, right? And a lot of excitement about the prospects here, and be able to put it in someone's hand so that it could experience, right, this inspiration wherever they were. And that was the hope.
I think you're onto something, Matt. I loved reading this book. You know, for many of my friends who are not vegan, this is going to be the book that I'm going to recommend because, like you said, it's an invitation to something good.
You're listening to Better Life for Animals podcast. Our mission is to amplify the voices of animal advocates, sanctuaries, and change makers working toward a kinder, more compassionate world. But we can't do it alone. We need your help. First of all, go ahead and subscribe to this channel wherever you're watching or listening. And then get involved by visiting betterlifeforanimals.com. That's betterlifeforanimals.com. Be sure to check out our blog, learn more about incredible sanctuaries, and explore our book section, where 100% of net proceeds from book sales are donated to sanctuaries. Every action you take helps to make a difference. And remember, subscribe to this channel. And now, back to the show.
Matt, how do animal sanctuaries help animals recover their innate behaviors and dignity, as highlighted in your discussions on institutional oppression?
Yeah, so I love sanctuaries, and I absolutely have to add a personal note here that a pilgrimage to Farm Sanctuary in Ithaca, New York was one of Susan and my first moves, you know, when we first got interested in these things. And I mention in the book, right? In fact, I think it's probably my favorite line in the book. It doesn't have to be anybody else's, you know, but when you're writing a book, there are some pages you feel like I knocked that out of the park. And then there are other pages you look at and you're like, maybe I got up on the wrong side of the bed that morning. But one of my favorite lines, if not my favorite line in the book, is that if you want to learn truly to love justice, feast your eyes and imagination on what flourishing lives look like, so you can see with clarity what oppression steals away. And I that insight has just been so important to my own journey, and especially to the way that I teach these issues. Because if you want to see so-called farmed animals, and I actually don't use that term. I like to say animals used for farming because that's the truth. If you want to see animals used for farming flourishing, you have one and only one option these days, and that's to go to a sanctuary where you can see what these lives could be like, right, when they are truly coming into their own. And in any farm, you know, whether it's an industrial farm, right, or a less intensive farm, there is no way to farm a sentient creature without institutionally oppressing them. And what I mean by that, right, is by the institution will put limits on their flourishing in keeping with the goals of the economic enterprise. Now, obviously, in industrial farms, it's horrific. Maybe people think it's somewhat less cruel, right? When you're talking about pasture-raised systems that are less intensive. No matter where you are on that spectrum, though, your institution is curtailing the instincts and the experiences and the lives and ultimately the flourishing of those creatures that you are instrumentalizing in order to use their bodies. Sanctuaries teach us beyond a shadow of a doubt that these are flourishing lives, sentient creatures with magisterial capacities for being. And to get to see that emanating from a chicken, a pig, a cow, a turkey, a goat, there's just a special magic to that, to be able to see all these creatures through the eyes of dignity and love in the same way that you view the dog snoring at your feet, right? As a life dignified and worthy of flourishing. And I owe that awakening in part to sanctuaries. And I just couldn't be more excited about your mission, Cheryl, because I think, until you've met other creatures as emissaries of flourishing, which is the only way to get to know what animals used for farming are like when they are at their best, when they are given a chance to be the beings they are. Boy, I'm glad there's someone out there like you making that information available so that others can have that transformational experience too.
Thank you, Matt. Beautifully put. But you also do talk about, that how that could run counter to the evolutionary force of inertia, and how we're wired to maintain the status quo. Do you ever run into that?
Absolutely. And first and foremost in myself, Cheryl, right? I mean, this is the thing that when I, first started thinking about these things, that complex inner family was in deep turmoil, right? Because it's one of those situations where, my intellectual commitments had come around. I saw that, okay, from the moral point of view, in terms of what the best science says, in terms of what, the most compelling philosophical arguments are, I know in my head, right, that I need to do something. But my gut wants a burger, right? And my heart wants to nuzzle a cow. And my moral self is sort of standing over the whole mess, leering down and wondering if we'll ever get it together, right? And that kind of turpitude, right? That sort of inner feelings of disharmony can make it really, really hard to find the inspiration and especially the motivation to make changes. And so whenever I'm talking about these things, I always want to acknowledge to everyone I meet that it is initially a learning curve, right? I think that the movement does a real disservice to itself and to the people we're welcoming in or hoping to welcome in when we act as though this isn't a feat, right? When we act as though this doesn't take some motivation and some inspiration and some work. And I think it makes perfect sense that it would, right? Because when we think about how closely our identities are woven through the food question, right? I mean, it's how we celebrate, it's how we mourn, it's how we worship, it's how we perform gender identity, it's how we perform our ethnic involvements, right? I mean, food is who we are. It's a cliche that you are what you eat, but heaven's sakes, some cliches, right, are grounded in the real.
It's a good one. Yeah.
And this is one of those. And so, of course, it's going to feel like it hurts to have to take a reflective look at these things that you've always taken for granted. What we eat is a lot like speaking our native tongue or breathing, right? It is so much a part of who we are that 99.9 repeating percent of the time, we're not reflecting on it, right? We can't reflect on it. It's so much a part of who we are that it's how our reality is mediated to our understanding. So it's painful to try to step back from it and take a more disinterested, right, or moral point of view on these matters. And so, yes, right, I run into that concern about identity, protective cognition, right? This phenomenon that social scientists describe when they say if somebody brings facts or philosophical arguments and they don't fit with how we understand ourselves and we feel that our comfort and security and the approval of the people in charge of our communities might have to be sacrificed, if we take this information on board, we'll do everything we can, right? The defenses go up immediately. And, we might feel a little shame, but our head will come rushing in with justifications. And the moral point of view will come rushing in with aid. It's one of those situations where it's very, very painful at the bottom of the learning curve. It almost feels like we can't do it. But the beautiful thing about going vegan, and this is what I spend a lot of time trying to do in Hungry Beautiful Animals, especially in that third chapter, is we actually are all already vegans in waiting when we
Mm-hmm.
really
Mm-hmm.
pay close attention. And what I mean by that is that we all have the beliefs, we all have the experiences, we all have the moral principles and the vision of the world to help us find great delight and even joy in the aspiration to go vegan. It's just that we haven't connected the dots in most cases, right? I think one of the greatest disservices the movement can do is to act as though it's some huge radical thing to go vegan. It's hard to go vegan. That's true because of the things we just talked about initially, right? At the bottom of the learning curve, it's tricky. But it's not tricky because we're being true to ourselves and now we have to move in a completely different radical direction. It's tricky because we're not being true to ourselves.
Right.
And learning that all the beliefs and all the values and the general vision of the world that we've had since we were knee high to a grasshopper, right? In the book, I call it kindergarten ethics.
That's
because
right.
these are views that we've held and beliefs that we've had since we read Charlotte's Web for the first time. And we're cheering for Wilbur and Charlotte and hoping that they didn't get squashed and become a pork chop, right? Things that
That's right.
all of us hoped for when we read that book. And so in my experience, right, we have to do two things at the same time. We have to admit that this is going to be difficult while at the same time recognizing that we're becoming more like the selves we already thought we were when we start taking these steps. That there's a deep continuity with who we thought we already were and with who we desire to be. And I want to focus on that continuity to encourage people, right? To take
Right.
those initially difficult first steps, because once you get up the gumption to take those steps, you realize, at least in my experience and experience teaching students over the last 20 years, you realize fairly quickly, this is who I've always thought I was. Somebody who
Right.
loves animals, somebody who wants to reduce suffering, somebody who wants to promote flourishing, somebody who cares about the environments that workers have to put up with, somebody who
Right.
cares about the planet and wants to see it be as beautiful and sustaining as possible for as many people as possible. These are very basic kindergarten values that we've learned to care about since we were, at our father's apron, at our mother's apron, as
Right.
little kids.
And the other side of that is once you connect with that, you talked about the emotional education when you cultivate and expand your awareness. You know, you can't go back.
No.
And I actually feel grateful sometimes that I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
It's because that muscle of compassion, because we've been taught to shut it down, I believe. We're being, it's okay now to turn it on because we're not participating in that. And there's a lot of joy in that. Wouldn't you agree?
Have so much joy, and it's joyful because of the way that it transforms your attention, right? I mean, I remember earlier in my life, finding bird song out on a beautiful spring day either annoying or exciting, depending on whether I was trying to work or whether I was, quote unquote, taking in nature. But in both cases, right, I was instrumentalizing the bird song. The bird song was about me, Matt Halteman. How's he feeling? Is he trying to work? In which case, this is a ruckus and a racket. Or is he observing, right, wild animals and enjoying it? In which case, but it was either my work or my entertainment. Once the attention of animal consciousness takes over and pushes you away from that instrumentalizing way of looking at other creatures and moves you in the direction of this awe, it's incredible, right? Because now
It is.
bird song is other creatures communicating, inviting each other to mate, inviting each other to come and see, inviting each other to stay away or I'm going to ruffle your feathers, right? There are whole worlds of mystery that are awesome to behold, and they're right under our noses at all times. And for me, some of the deepest joy of, going vegan over time is having that expanded sense of consciousness where suddenly something as banal and prosaic as a squirrel, right, crossing in front of my car becomes this dazzling occasion for awe. Right, as I watch gape jawed as the squirrel just scampers vertically up a tree, right, and disappears into the boughs. I mean, every squirrel is a parkour master that makes the YouTube parkour videos look silly, right, by comparison. And once you have the eyes to see that, the world is just an increasingly dazzling place. And I think that's my favorite thing about the vegan journey is that when you get far enough into it and the animal consciousness really expands, the world is just, the beauty is almost unfathomable. It's not almost unfathomable, it is unfathomable. The fact that we can't take it all in is part of what creates that sense of joy, because you feel that the mystery is much too big, right, for my tiny little experience to encompass it all. And so you just have this sense of bearing witness to something incredible, something transcendent. And actually, I should rephrase that, someone incredible, someone
yes,
transcendent.
Because they are all sentient beings. I really did love that part of the book too, where you talk about, let's just take our lawns as an example. Now, I live in the desert, and I know that, where you live, you do have green grass, but what if we just let it go and we had wildflowers, and then we would have bees, and then we would have birds. I thought that was such a beautiful image. I've seen it where it's done, and I think that that's where you're saying it's like as we slow down and we take in all that's around us, you start to appreciate the small animals as well as the large, including those gateway animals such as our dogs. I love your story about Gus because it's very similar to my story with my dog Ruby, where, before this particular dog, I didn't look at animals as family members. But I love how you talk about the parallels between, because of Gus, he was, I believe, a bulldog. So, there's some awkward breeding going on there, which we do intentionally to farm animals every day, which is unfortunate. But I also loved your most impactful connection, which was when you were faced with cleaning up after Gus. Can you tell us what happened?
Oh my gosh. Well, yeah, I hope it won't trigger my gag. Readers of the book will know there's a very painful episode here. So, and I hope it doesn't get too graphic. I'll try to keep it, listener friendly. But
sure.
To make a long story short, let's just say Michigan winters are brutal enough that, let's just put it nicely, you're not going to get out and pick up every resulting effort of your animal to defecate, right? Because it's too cold. And so over the course of a winter, the yard can really become foul. And because in Michigan we have these long stretches of, right, it might snow November 8th, and then you don't get to see the ground again until April. We've had a little bit of a tamer one this year, but some years, right, it's a blanket of white, all winter long. And then on the soggy edge of spring, suddenly all that apathy and laziness of the guardian comes, well, I was going to say blissfully to light, but it's not blissful at all, right? It's actually disgusting. And so one fine day on the soggy edge of a Michigan spring, I came home a little bit late. Our dog sitter had called and said, I can't get over there. I'm sick today. So I was, running late, had to teach a class, got out of there, got home. Gus was probably, 2 hours delayed. I opened his little crate and he lumbered out. He was looking pretty upset. Anybody who has a dog knows how this works, right? When you're in the doghouse, when you're the human in the doghouse.
That's right.
And Gus was looking surly, to say the least. And when you're an English bulldog and you look surly, it's an intimidating affair. So out lumbers Gus, and I opened the door to let him outside. And the yard is just, trashed. Like the poor thing can't find a patch to do his business. And he just looks at me, and I had this moment. We've all had these absurd moments, right, with our fellow creatures where we're sort of like in this deep confusion. I'm sort of thinking, why do dogs have to go to the bathroom? Why do I have to clean it up? What am I going to do? So I go inside, and it's important to this story to add, I have a pretty hair trigger gag reflex. So as a parent, for instance, learning to change diapers was a pretty significant challenge. Anytime vomit is on the scene, I'm in big trouble, right? And if I get going with this sort of gag reflex thing, it can really double me over. And if you've ever had, right, a gagging episode, your larynx and pharynx can get going to such a degree that it'll like seize up your pelvic floor, and it's almost like you're paralyzed. It's a really terrible feeling, and I hate that feeling. So I resented very deeply having to go inside and get my two little grocery bag mitts to go out there and start the cleanup. And so I started the cleanup, and half a bag into it, the gag reflex just started up, and my eyes started to water. I'm sitting there, and I kind of had this, I don't know what else to call it except an epiphany. There was this moment of clarity where Gus suddenly became symbolic of the hundreds of billions of creatures who have to live in conditions like these, in their own feces, waiting on the whims of an apathetic and careless humanity, right? Having these terrible lives. Gus became every single one of those creatures writ small. And my blasted yard became a metaphor for the planet, right? It's sagging in despair under the laziness and lack of stewardship, right? Of those of us who can't even bother to take care of our own. And I became sort of an emblem of humankind, writ very, very small, kind of bullied by convenience, bullied by a certain standard of living into just ignoring responsibilities that were now coming back to roost and making all of us miserable. And that was one of those experiences. We've all had these experiences where the universal just sort of floods into our tiny particular little lives with such force that life almost feels like a poem in those moments, right? There's this almost mystical clarity, that something has just happened, a bolt from the blue, a message from the cosmos, whatever your language is, right, for describing one of those key epiphanic moments. That was when the suffering of all the other creatures came to matter to me in a visceral way. I had known about it before in some sort of theoretical sense. I cared about it. I knew I ought to be doing something, but it was never enough before to move all those disturbing facts from the kind of ticker tape at the bottom of the cable TV news to something that I felt deeply and viscerally enough to make a change. And that was it, right? That was the experience that just made it impossible to go back. And I should add, right, it was an experience of suffering. And it's an experience that I would want to juxtapose with what was happening in my yard, right, a few years later in the growth curve, right? Because while my initial experience of coming to care about the lives of other creatures was saturated in suffering and shame and blame and self-doubt, that eventually gave way to a whole new vision of the world, right? Where eventually I was able to kick that shame and blame to the curb and see everything from Gus to my yard to the whole grand scheme from the soil to the stratosphere as something beautiful that I have this incredible gift to be a part of and to participate in. So yeah, from poop to transcendence, right?
Right.
It's the human story from poop to transcendence about sums it up.
But I find it to be so impactful. I love that word visceral because we will all have those moments where it's not what you learned or what someone said, it's how you felt.
Mm.
And I also have to tell you, I really loved that story that you shared about the Holocaust because
Mm.
I've struggled with that myself. It's like,
Mhm.
to me, what we're doing to animals is just as is horrific, just as was the Holocaust. And how do you make that connection? And I love how you talk about, being animalized, then instrumentalized, and then
Mm.
finally consumed. It's like we make them something else in order to be able to participate in that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the first thing I have to say is I can't take credit for that beautiful insight. That is an insight that I got after the fact from reading Afko and Silko's amazing book, Afroism. And I'll say a little bit about the initial experience too, and then talk about how Af and Sil helped me to see this in a little bit different way. So I'll try to make a long story short because it's involved in the book, and we'll leave something for people to read on their own.
Absolutely.
But the short version is, when I was when I was first going vegan, I'm not gonna lie, I still loved the smell of meat. I love to think about eating meat. It was kind of one of those things where you know how shoulds and oughts are. Even when you
Hmm.
feel you ought, it's not like you're excited about this, right? And so it's like I wanted to continue eating meat. And so occasionally I'd drive by my favorite restaurant and I'd put on the recirculate to smell the ribs, right? They have the rib smokers in the parking lot, and my car would fill with smoke. And then I'd drive the rest of the way home lamenting that I was about to go make a curried carrot soup when what I really wanted to be doing, right, was eating the barbecue back ribs. And one day in particular, I was driving by and I filled the car with smoke. And at that precise moment, there was an interview on NPR with Elie Wiesel.
Hmm.
And he was talking about how, of course the Germans must have known because the smell was in the air and the ashes were coming down from the sky. And he said the word crematorium, or I heard the word crematorium. This is quite a while ago, so I can't remember. You know how memories are. It's sort of like you
Hmm.
remember the feeling, even if not,
Hmm.
all the exact words. But as I recall it, the word crematorium was, came into my consciousness at the very moment that I took this deep inhale of the rib smoke that was in the car. And I just had this, I don't know how else to describe it. I just broke down, right? I mean,
Hmm.
I realized for the first time that there's this body taken by violence, and that what I smelled as sort of, oh, this is the delicious smell of my pig roast at my church in the Harvest Festival. That's always how I had experienced it before. And somehow the coincidence, right, of the crematorium in the Nazi death camps and this smell that I was reveling in hit me, right, and completely flipped the script on that experience. And initially, Cheryl, I was really defensive about this, right? Because I'm not Jewish.
Hmm.
We all know that comparing suffering across species, even comparing suffering across different people groups, every people group is their own, right? People groups are not metaphors that we use to make hay and especially when we're talking about, comparing the subjective experience of horrors that people experience. I at least felt extremely uncomfortable with what initially felt to me like a comparison, right, of suffering human beings with suffering pigs. That felt all wrong to me, and yet I couldn't deny that there had been this major emotional and spiritual event, right, in the
Right.
coincidence of those ideas. And so I kept it to myself. I was very leery to talk about that. It just felt wrong. And then years later, I came across this book by Afko and Silko, which I mentioned previously, and there was an essay in it where they talk about that comparing the suffering of different groups really doesn't make sense, right? Everybody's experience is different, and comparing those experiences is not the way to get traction on what the movement needs. What they called my attention to instead was, instead of comparing the subjective experiences of different oppressed groups, what if we turned our attention instead to the way that the oppressor proceeds with that oppression, no matter who it is they're oppressing?
Mm-hmm.
And what it turns out is true across all cases of oppression is that the oppressor follows this threefold logic, right? First, you animalize the person or the being, right? That is to say, you reduce them to lesser than. If they're a human being, you dehumanize them, right? Into an animal-like creature whose culture is brutish, right? Or whose language is crude, or, whatever the case may be. If it's another creature, you call attention to or animalize, it's just all 8 million species of other creatures fit into this one lump category, animal, right? And as long as we know that the being falls under that heading, animal, we know that their interests aren't important, they're not ends in themselves, right? And so the first step is animalizing, reduce a sentient being to a lesser than, right? And then the second step is instrumentalizing. Turn the animal into a tool, right? So once you've stripped them of the dignity, well, then you can use them for what you want. And then that third step, and of course in practice, these are kind of simultaneous. It doesn't have to happen in 3 separate stages. Once you've turned them into a tool, then you consume them. Right? You can kill them, you can use them, you can eat them, you can exterminate them. And I found that incredibly helpful, because now I saw, I wasn't really making a comparison at all, right? I mean, I wasn't comparing the unlike suffering of Jewish people with the suffering of non-human beings, even though initially I thought that's what I was doing, and I found that deeply worrisome. What I was doing instead was intuitively noticing how oppression works, right? You animalize the being, you instrumentalize the being, you consume the being, and that process happens regardless of what form of oppression we're talking about. And that just was like, it's like the heavens opened up. That just, it made sense of that experience that I was initially uncomfortable with. And it also made it so clear why going vegan is of a piece with all these other movements for justice, that animate our imaginations when we're at our best. If we want a feminist world, right, where half the world has their dignity appropriately recognized, right? If we want an anti-racist world, right, where we're moving toward a vision of justice that encompasses all human beings. If we want a world where species is not what's important, but sentience, or the possibility for creaturely flourishing, is what's important, right? Whatever it is that we see as, a movement away from oppression and towards justice and joy, we find that oppressor's logic at work. And so I love, another book written by AFCO talks about how this insight, it's called Get Out. And she talks about how this insight can help us to strike at the root of these forms of oppression, rather than be arguing amongst ourselves over which ism is the most important one to dismantle, right? Well, instead of arguing of which ism is the most important one to dismantle, we see their common root in this oppressive way of being toward the world, and we attack there, right? Rather than, comparing these different things and getting distracted right?
Right.
By trying to compare things that are not ultimately alike, and getting ourselves into difficulty there.
Right. If you're just joining us, we're speaking with Matthew Halteman, author of Hungry, Beautiful Animals, and this is Better Life for Animals. Matthew, how do you envision veganism as a transformative force for communities, both human and non-human?
Yeah. So, Cheryl, the first thing I'll say, and I know, right, veganism is a term that we commonly associate with our movement. But one of the things I'm trying to do in Hungry, Beautiful Animals is have a little sort of terminological shift from thinking about veganism, which, because it's an ism, I think people often associate it with more rigid, sort of rule based, identity focused ways of thinking about life. And sometimes, right, when we're in the grips of an ism, there's this feeling like, well, if we put one foot out of line, we're not in the club anymore. Right, or
Right.
if there's a leather belt in the deepest reaches of our closet, we're not a vegan after all. Right, or if we have a fish taco because it's our uncle's specialty, and in a moment of trying to balance the interests of family and our vegan commitments, we decide to tip the scale in the direction of the familial on that one particular occasion. Then we're out, we're not a vegan anymore.
Right. Veganism is not about perfection.
That's right. So I like to sort of build that into the way we talk about it, and talk, instead of veganism, about going vegan, right? And what I mean by going vegan is this: it's an aspiration, right? So there's this beautiful vision of a vegan world. We know we're too small as individuals to bring that about ourselves. So we can start by taking the weight of the world off our shoulders, recognizing that there's no way to do this perfectly, recognizing that each of us has our own tiny little talents and gifts on our tiny little patch of land, and what it looks like for each and every one of us to go vegan is going to be a little bit different, right? Based on how that grand aspiration trickles down into the soil of that tiny little patch of being, right? That each of us has. But the way that I think about, going vegan being transformational for both, right, ourselves as individuals and the world as a whole, is to think about how much more beautiful our lives are, both inside and out, when that complex inner family that is at the root of everything we do, right? That really complex family of parts. We've got, we're physical organisms. We have social relationships to the communities around us. We have deep emotions that help to regulate those social involvements and help us stay on track. We have intellectual lives where we can kind of stand back from the emotional and social connections and think in a more disinterested way. And we have the moral point of view that enables us to think beyond the ethics of our own little communities and to think more globally, right, about what is right from the perspective of the universe. All that complex stuff is going on inside us. And most of us know it can be a struggle, right, to get those different parts of who we are working together in harmony. Going vegan is a bigger joy aggregator in terms of getting our inner family together than any single discipline that I've ever come across in 20 years of teaching spiritual exercises in philosophy classes, right? A spiritual exercise is a repetitive daily practice that helps to harmonize those different parts, right, of who we are through the practice, right? Calling our attention to how much farther we have to go while simultaneously pushing us in the direction of that beautiful aspiration that we've set for ourselves. Going vegan makes us physically, right, more healthful. Going vegan enables us to achieve a social consciousness, not just of the lives of other human beings around us that are doing the work, but of our fellow creatures, the animals, whether they're the ones in farms or the ones out there in the world outside. Emotionally, there's a coherence that we can have in going vegan. When we recognize that the dog's snoring at our feet in bed, right, is the very same sort of creature from the moral point of view, from the emotional point of view, as the animals in farms and forests, right? That emotional
Absolutely.
coherence is a beautiful thing intellectually and morally. It enables us to live up to the aspirations we have from kindergarten onward, to be the sort of people who try to reduce the suffering of creatures who can suffer and foment the flourishing of creatures who can flourish. So what it does on the inside is it pulls all these different parts of who we are together into harmony in ways that are deeply beautiful to experience. And once that joy is aggregated on the inside, Cheryl, I don't know if you're like me, but boy, when I'm experiencing joy, my ability to take my talents and gifts out into the world with passion and joy is exponentially multiplied, right? When I'm fighting, when all the different parts of my inner family can't decide what's what, I lack motivation. I often fall into despair. Self-doubt takes over the inner family. I don't know where to start. But when those different parts of me are working together as a family and creating that sense of joy and fulfillment that comes from harmony across those different provinces, well, boy, that's when I'm ready to get out there with a book tour. That's when I'm ready to host the greatest potluck in the history of small groups. That's when I'm ready to get into the second hour in Sunday school and talk about things you don't usually learn about in church. That's when I'm ready to get out there, right, at a soccer match and talk to people about how much better I feel physically, right, since I've started making these choices. And so it concentrates our power to have that inner joy when we get to the business of being the change that we want to see in the world. And of course, you know, listeners to this podcast probably know that, you know, according to Joseph Poor, an Oxford researcher, right, there's no better thing we can do for the world at large than to go vegan because of the environmental impacts, the climate change prospects. And so I just think it's incredible how we get all this inner harmony that generates all this joy to go out and make the world a place that's vastly better, to spread justice and joy for ourselves, for our fellow human beings, for our fellow creatures, the animals, for the earth, for the climate, right? I said it once, I'll say it a million more times. From soil to stratosphere, this is an exercise that has healing power that's really beyond belief. And so it's a beautiful, beautiful thing to experience. And for those who haven't given it a whirl, taste and see. I mean, it is really a joy aggregator in a way that very few other practices I've tried are.
So beautifully put, Matthew. What a beautiful invitation. This has just been the best conversation. Tell us how we can find you.
Yeah, so easy to find me at hungrybeautifulanimals.com. That's hungrybeautifulanimals.com. The title of the book was weird enough that the .com was still available. So that's where you can find me. And I love to hear from people, and especially if you're, you know, thinking of embarking on this journey, but you have questions or concerns. Remember, I'm an educator first. I'm much less interested in selling books than I am in helping people to be the change they want to see in the world and experience that inner transformation. So whether or not you're going to buy the book, you can feel free to email me and start a conversation on how to reap this joy in your own life. I'd absolutely love to hear from you.
Thank you. I do recommend that you buy the book, though. It's a fabulous read. This has been such a fun conversation. Thank you so much for being on the show. And this is Cheryl Moss with Better Life for Animals.
Thank you for joining us on the Better Life for Animals podcast. Together, we can create a world where all beings are treated with dignity, respect, and care. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're listening. It helps us reach more people and spread awareness about the incredible work happening in animal sanctuaries. You can also share this episode with friends and fellow advocates to keep the conversation going. Until next time, keep speaking up, taking action, and making a difference for the animals.